The book of Esther is perfect proof that God isn't just behind the scenes, but he controls the scenes he's behind. And although the name of God is not mentioned once in the entire book, it's the nature of God that should cause us to take a second look. From the raising up of Esther to be queen, to the recycling of Haman's gallows, who would fall prey to his own scheme, the silent sovereignty of God shows us that nothing in life is by chance or coincidence, but rather providence. Throughout the pages of this book, we see that God may be silent, but he is never absent. And when it seems as if evil is poised to be the final judgment, no weapon formed against God's people will be triumphant. So just as Esther interceded with the truth, likewise in these last days is the role of the church. You see, God's sovereignty is best summarized in Mordecai's exhortation to Esther in the midst. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This is Esther, silent sovereignty.
That's how my soul feels right about now before I begin a message. But most of the lessons that we learned last Sunday are actually heard in that sermon bumper. The idea behind God remaining silent but never absent. The silent sovereignty of God. Remember, sovereignty defined is supreme rulership. God has supreme rule over all of the world, past, present, and future. God sits enthroned in the heavens. He rules over all. He is the one in control, according to Daniel, in the realm of man. The rising and the falling of empires, kings, countries, politicians is in God's hand, and he uses it all. Now remember, sovereignty is one of God's highest qualities that are made up of some of the characteristics of God theologically: omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, all-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere, at all times. These are the characteristics of God. And then there's this other word that can be tucked under sovereignty, and it's providence. Providence, if you recall, different from the miraculous. Remember, a miracle is when God overrides the natural with the supernatural. That was a miracle. Providence is God using the natural supernaturally. Your life is providential, whether you realize it or not. From your birth to your death, God will often use the natural, the things that we don't even see, or the things that we do see, and we discount or discredit as, that was chance, that was a coincidence, that was fate, all the while using the natural supernaturally. The intersections of our lives with other people, at certain places, at certain times, it's providence. So to wrap up chapter 1, in one statement, it's this. Please get this. There is no such thing as human chance. There is no such thing as coincidence, just divine providence. That right there should be the anchor to your faith. Now, remarkably, Esther reads like a play. The narrative. We were introduced to some of the main actors. I will call them actors because there's really only one main character, and it's God. Though his name is not mentioned, his nature is interwoven through the pages of the scripture. And the reason why that is crucial to understand as we begin is because in chapter 2, we're going to look at some hidden plots. Plots that are hidden. Things that are happening behind the scenes. But also, as a believer, you can trust that God controls what's happening behind the scenes, behind the curtain. Right before the actors come out and they read their parts, and like off to the side of the stage, there's something that's brewing and happening, and only the audience can see it, but the actors over here have no idea what's coming. Like, this is what we have access to. But more than that, our God controls what is behind the scenes. Look at me. He also controls what is behind the scene. What you see, God is behind. And that's important because what I see at times, man, that didn't look good. From the naked eye, that didn't feel good. What I see can often dictate my faith. And faith is like a telescope, biblically speaking. Think about what a telescope does. Faith, true faith, biblical worldview. When I look at the lens or the telescope of God's word, and faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of God, and my faith grows and my faith advances and it gets stronger. So no matter what storm comes my way, whatever uncertainty in my life, faith grows like a telescope. What does a telescope do? It takes what's far and brings it near. Wow. It takes what's blurry and faith makes it clear. This is what faith does. This is how God shows out his providence in the book of Esther. Chapter 2 begins with a timestamp, often overlooked, but we're going to look into it. Esther 2, verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. A lot just in this one verse. And again, before we even jump into verse 2, verse 1 gives us a timestamp. After these things, Bible students, when scriptures have phraseology like that, the question you ask the text is, after what things? That should take you on a journey, not just back to chapter 1. Remember, last Sunday, we set the historical context. The historical context after these things, remember that 6-month summit, it was a military strategy session where he brought in all of his leaders, his generals, his nobles, his princes. Why? The Greco-Persian Wars had began in 490 BC. King Ahasuerus, namely on the history books, Xerxes from the movie 300, he reigns from 486. At 486, he begins to plot his revenge on the Greeks. His father had died before he could exact his revenge on the little city-states of Greece at this time. He calls a summit. He needed to convince the powers and the resources of his kingdom that they had what it took to go back to Greece and overthrow these little colonies. After the 6 months, what does he do? He throws a 7-day party. Why? Because now he's got the green light to go to war, and he's going to need the buy-in from his army and the soldiers, which were made up of fathers and husbands and sons. So the people get to participate in the celebration, premature, of the eventual war of going back and exacting revenge on Greece. He does that in 482. Remember, that party was 483. A year later, he's on his way to Greece. History tells us, ancient history tells us, he took several million men, an army that had not been seen of this magnitude in all of history. More modern historians say it wasn't necessarily millions, it was more or less hundreds of thousands. Nonetheless, this is a huge army to come up against, as we know it, little platoons of Grecians, the Athenians, the Spartans, and we know 2 major battles in human history. Again, when you know these battles, you go, oh my goodness, that's actually the timestamp in the Bible, in the book of Esther. And I'm like, yes, it's so remarkable. The battle known as Thermopylae, the Hot Gates in the movie 300, where 300 Spartans, it was more about 7,000 accurately, they went into the Hot Gates and they pushed back the Persian warriors of Xerxes' kingdom. They eventually were defeated from the rear, based on, that's a true story, a Grecian person, a Spartan told the Persians of an exit to get them from the back. But that wasn't the only blow that King Xerxes took. The naval battle at Salamis, he suffered a huge defeat. It took 2 years for these Greco-Persian wars to stop. He does not necessarily win outright because he comes home demoralized. Xerxes does. He gets home around 480. After these things, after his morale being wounded, he comes home. He's in his palace. He then remembers Vashti. looking for comfort from his previous wife. But the law of the Medes and the Persians says you cannot reverse something that was decreed. Had he been able to reverse the decree, would he have brought Vashti back for comfort? Perhaps. That's one of those details in the Bible that we have to understand, because if the decree could have been reversed, the role of Esther would have been erased. So even these laws by the Medes and the Persians that were somewhat tyrannical, even God was using them because there needed to be a vacancy at the throne in order for Esther to rise. So think about what Vashti did. She was unwilling to pose, so she was deposed. She's no longer in place, and God is using all of these details, these battles for him to come home. He is remembering Vashti, but the law on the book says he cannot reverse it. And here you have something in the text that if you only see with your naked eye, you will miss what's happening in the spiritual eye. I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. Get this. If all you see is what you see, you are not seeing all you're intended to see in life as a Christian. If all you see is actually what you see physically, then you're not seeing all that God intends you to see. And I think a lot of the reason the church has been on the sideline, especially the past 2 years, is because we've been responding to all that we've seen. But there's more that's happening. So faith sees it from a lens that is provided in the Bible. Verse 2-4, then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Verse 3, let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom. Remember, there's 127 provinces, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel. That's the capital. And to the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. You will notice how many times the advisors to the king make his decisions. It's pretty interesting. This is a hidden plot, because later on in the story, he's finally going to make his own decision at the right time. But what's happening here? Those closest to him, they're noticing his countenance. The king is depressed. So they come up with an idea, because he can't override the previous set decree. Let's have a beauty pageant, in essence. King, let's bring in all the virgins, all of the beautiful women of the kingdom, and let's have a contest, and you get to choose one out of the millions that would eventually replace Vashti as queen. Now, remember this detail. The law is mandatory. The throne is vacant. This sets the stage for what is called a divine lottery. What do I mean by that? 127 provinces. They say there was probably 50 million people in the Persian Empire. Divide that in half. Let's just say, generally speaking, there's probably 25 million women of all ages. So that number's a little bit smaller, depending on who was eligible to be a contestant in the Miss Persia beauty contest. But that is eventually reduced to, historians say, 400 virgins in all of the kingdom were gathered into the palace. And out of the 400, which was reduced from 25 million, we're left with one, namely a Jewish orphan named Esther. Of all the people in the entire kingdom, Esther's entire upbringing, the way she was raised, the things she suffered, all of which were bringing her to a place in time that God would use her in such a great way that we can glean the lesson from her life and see the providence of God. Remember, the book of Esther is miraculous because it's meticulous. The details, they're so minute. They are seemingly insignificant. Yet when you take a closer look, you realize God is doing a work. The God that controls the atoms that you can't see, the planets that you can see, the amount of hairs on your head, the God that controls the sparrow that falls from the sky. And Jesus said that doesn't happen apart from the Father's will. Roadkill on the side of the road, that did not happen outside of God's sovereignty. Did that comfort anybody today? You're like, yeah, I'm the one that hit the rabbit. Verse 5-6, what's happening here? There is a beauty pageant brewing. In Shushan the citadel, verse 5, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Right there you have 3 to 4 generations. Mordecai, Jair, Shimei, and Kish, a Benjamite. You have his people. Kish now, ready, had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom now we're in Babylon's kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. When did this happen? This happened in 597 BC. Remember, when Babylon came on the scene, it was 605. The first time they came into Jerusalem, they took captives with them. In that first group of captives is Daniel, the book of Daniel. He's taken as a prisoner as a teenager into Babylon. The next time the king would come back into Jerusalem would be 597, where he would take 10,000 more Jews. In that group, Ezekiel. God is doing something. Every single time it seemed like there was a tragedy, a setback, a calamity, God was raising up one of his own. He always works with that same model. And then again in 586 BC, where the temple was completely destroyed. So who is this that's taken in 597 BC? It says Kish. This is Mordecai's great-grandfather. We do not know how old he was. So I don't want to spend too much time trying to figure out how old is Mordecai. What I do see, though, if this is 597 BC, and Xerxes is in 480 BC, that's more than 100 years. So Mordecai was likely born in Babylon. And when he's born in Babylon, he may have saw the kingdom overthrown, and now he's taken from Babylon to Susa, Persia. You know how far that is from each other? 120 miles. These are significant details. Why is that significant? Think about this. The Jews are in a foreign land, they're prisoners. Babylon is overtaken by the Medes and the Persians. And yet God is allowing Mordecai's family and Mordecai himself to be placed at such a time in human history that he would eventually raise up Mordecai to influence his cousin Esther for such a time as this. See, God never leaves himself without a witness. Are you that witness? He never leaves himself without a voice, without a witness. And he never leaves the witness without his presence. Mordecai, his name is actually Persian or Babylonian. Mordecai is not Jewish. Mordecai is related to one of their gods. So it's interesting that we're going to see name changes in the text. And Mordecai, who is the cousin of Esther, verse 7. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah. That is Esther. 2 names. Why? They had their Jewish name, which had great meaning. And when they were captives, whether in Babylon or Persia, they had Persian names or Babylonian names. We saw that in the book of Daniel, didn't we? Daniel and his 3 friends' names were changed, and they were given Babylonian names. It tells us that Esther and Mordecai are relatives. By way of who? His uncle's daughter. So think about your uncle's daughter, that's your cousin. She had neither father nor mother. Why not? The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Several things are mentioned here about Esther. Her beauty. In fact, if you were going to read it properly in Hebrew, the young woman was lovely to look at in form and fashion. She was beautiful. She made people look twice. The Bible goes out of its way to talk about the physical appearance multiple times with several characters. Not to be overlooked. It's something, but beauty's not everything. But there's something about the way God crafted Esther and the way she was shaped and the way she looked that he's going to use to capture or conquer the heart of a pagan king later on in the text. Because remember, this is a beauty pageant that is brewing. What about Esther? She loses her parents. We don't know when. Esther is definitely born in the Persian Empire. She inherits captivity. We have no clue in our present day what that even means. She inherits circumstances she could not control. She loses a mother and a father, which probably left a hole. Mordecai fills the void. Mordecai raises her as his daughter. So he's probably X amount of years older than she is. So there's this relationship of a father-daughter, not just cousins. Now, I'm simply looking at that, and I don't want to read too much into the text, but I'm simply looking at it and saying, wow, how many of us have things in our past or present that we struggle with? Whether somebody in our life is no longer there, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a spouse, all of these circumstances can lead us to be bitter towards God. And bitterness, which is a root, can grow if it's not cut out. And bitterness is often the result of not understanding God's providence. Let me say that again. Bitterness, how could God do this? If anyone had a reason to complain, it's Esther. I'm born into a foreign land. I don't have a mother or father. What is God up to? I thought he was for our people. Aren't we the chosen Jews? That would be the questions that would be normalized in a young girl like Esther. I don't know if Mordecai would have shaped her view about the God of the Old Testament scriptures that they had access to, the prophecies, but nonetheless, I want to make a point here because a lot of us struggle with bitterness. Bitterness is the result of not believing in God's goodness. People become bitter because they think God has forgotten them. That Pastor, if God is so good, then why did this happen? I get that question all the time. Some are tragedies. It's hard to just give them a Bible verse and say, man, trust God. I get that. I've been in the thick of circumstances where it's hard to breathe. And you can't see on the other side of the tunnel. And you don't know where God's at. But this is where faith kicks in. Remember, we walk by what? Faith, not by what we see. Because if what we see is all we see, then we're not seeing all we're intended to see. So God's working. And providence and understanding it removes bitterness because I trust his goodness. You know what else providence does? It frees me from bitterness. It makes me firm in my confidence. Man, those circumstances must be tough. I don't know why it's happening, but I trust the God who controls them. It also fuels my endurance. I can keep moving through circumstances that don't look good or feel good because God's providence is certainly at work. Another example in the Bible is Joseph, right? Genesis 37 to Genesis 50. And another amazing story that has God's providence. Everything is set up. The fact that Joseph was betrayed by his very own blood. His brothers threw him into a pit and wanted to leave him for dead. Oh, you're telling me that God's providence wanted him there? I'm like, yeah, because if he didn't land in the pit, he would have been sold as a slave. And if he wasn't sold as a slave, he wouldn't end up in Egypt. And if he's not in Egypt, he can't be accused of rape. And if he doesn't get accused of rape falsely, he can't be an inmate of the state. And if he's not an inmate of the state, he's not in the right place to help interpret dreams of two inmates. And if he doesn't interpret the dreams of the two inmates, the one that gets released isn't going to have the intel to tell the Pharaoh, you're having a dream. I know someone that can interpret your dream. And if that doesn't happen, he's not called out of the jail cell in a day and placed as the prime minister over all the land of Egypt. Why? Because God never leaves himself without a witness. This is all God using the natural supernaturally in the book of Genesis and Joseph. Let me say it again. Hidden plots, seeing behind the scene, seeing behind what is seen, seeing even when you can't see. Wait, what? Dr. Moon, not a character from X-Men. He was a youth in England when he had scarlet fever and he was stricken with blindness in one eye. By the time he was 21 years of age, he lost both uses of his eyesight, his eyes. He was completely blind by 21. It's recorded in his journal that's struggling through the ability to see at one point and now can't see, that he said, God, take this talent of blindness and use it for your glory. To which God inspired Dr. Moon to create the Moon alphabet for the blind, or Moon Code, which was an easier way to help those who were blind to read, ready? The Bible. Thousands of people were able to read the Bible because of Dr. Moon's willingness to see God's providence. Even when he couldn't see physically, he knew God was going to use that affliction, and he did. That's how the believer needs to see what's happening, because it may not look like God is behind what is seen. I get that. But faith knows God is the one in control behind the scenes. Got to get that. Verse 8. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace and to the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Hey, don't get it twisted for even a second. This was not something that these women, a majority, would be looking forward to. You're not talking about the Miss America contest that you can compete for, you can be elected for. You're talking about them coming into the home, seeing a lovely young lady, and taking her as basically a prisoner to be subjected to the king's harem, to be just another concubine or one of his wives, a sex slave, to be real, because Xerxes, according to history, was a sexual deviant. He was a maniac. Esther is taken. Some have suggested Mordecai gave. No, there's nowhere in the text. You cannot be dogmatic about this. It says they saw her, they took her. She's taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the woman. Again, you got to imagine the stomach dropping. Can it get any worse? We were minding our own business. X amount of years ago, Queen Vashti does not want to show off for the king. He puts out a decree to all the land that the men should be the heads of their home. He comes back defeated from war. His wise men have an idea to appease his sick pleasures. Let's have a beauty contest. Let's take young virgins from their homes. Esther. Verse 9. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So this is one of the eunuchs. He sees Esther. There's something about her, her beauty externally. And I bet as he got to know her, there was a beauty internally, which is more important than the external. And he begins to give her favor in such a way that, watch this. So he readily gave beauty preparations to Esther. Besides her allowance, besides the norm, then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. This is like a replication of Joseph. He finds favor in the house. She finds favor in the house. Now, I cannot help but touch on this because in my mind, this is how it computes. 7 choice maidservants. Now, if you're reading carefully, you would have noticed the number 7 show up in chapter 1 multiple times. Did you catch it? 6-month celebration or 6-month summit planning a military strategy. And then they had a 7-day party. On the 7th day, Vashti does not come to the king. This would create the wise men telling him to put out a decree. She is no longer queen on the 7th day. So what happens is he has 7 eunuchs go try to get her. And then when that doesn't happen, there are 7 wise men that come and give him the counsel. And now we have 7 choice maidservants. You're going, what is he talking about? I'm talking about biblical numerology. The number 7 in the Bible is God's number. So even though it don't look good, things are happening, God is putting his fingerprint on circumstances like, hey, it doesn't look good, but you have no idea what I'm up to. The number 7 keeps showing up. Let's keep reading. Watch what happens. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Why? Because he loved her. This is his daughter. essentially. So he's showing up outside of the women's quarters and he's hoping for a report, right? Why don't you do that, Dad? Why don't you show up like, how's she doing in there? Can you tell me anything about that one girl? But he's not allowing her to reveal her identity, her heritage. Why? Anti-Semitism was on the rise. The climate of those that hated the Jews. So a lot of people have written into these types of verses that, look at that, they're ashamed of their heritage. They should be bold and proud about being a believer. Like today, we should not hide the fact that we're Christians. I'm going, you're missing the point. That's not what's happening here. Because at the most opportune time, the most dangerous time, the time where you would want to keep it from being known, that's the time that she would reveal that she's a Jew. It's all setting the stage. It's all hidden plots, We are given access to see behind the scenes. Verse 12, each young woman's turn came to go into the king, Ahasuerus, after she had completed 12 months of preparation, according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. What's happening here? This is a year-long spa day. Why 12 months? This seems extravagant. Think with me, will you? More than 9 months, intentionally, so that the king would never father an illegitimate child. They wanted to make sure every young lady they brought in was not pregnant with somebody else's seed. So it had to be dragged out. Now we add another 12 months to the process. 400 young virgins being beautified to literally be eye candy and much more to the king. Yeah, I bet many probably were looking forward to it. I bet many thought this would be the ticket out of the slums. But most of them, they do not want to be in this position. All make-uped up, thus prepared, each young woman went into the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace, whatever perfume and whatever outfit she wanted to wear. Because when she's coming into the king's presence, she had one shot, at least according to the contest, to get his undivided attention so that he would eventually select her. Verse 14, in the evening she went, at night, in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shagaj, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. If she was not able to be chosen by the king, she would be left to live in a harem for the rest of her life. They do not send these young ladies home. She would become a widow, in essence, left to live in a concubine, a harem, as nothing more than one of the king's concubines. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. I don't know much about what's happening here other than to say, Esther is not trying to dazzle herself up. She's not looking for the best outfit. She's simply trusting in the custodian's advisement. Hey, what do you think? You know him best. How should I present myself? So there's like wisdom here, there's prudence here, and then of course this verse, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. That's the second time we see that. Are you seeing that on the screen? Verse 9, the young woman pleased him, and she obtained favor. Verse 15, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. Now again, this type of favor here, this idea speaks to external beauty. I don't want you to miss this, because a lot of times external beauty can bring favor, especially for a young woman. And I know for a fact, if you may allow me to brag on my wife for a moment, who is extremely beautiful. Don't look, guys, look at me. And when she was on her way to visit me, I'm an inmate of the state. She's coming up for a visit. She, I guess excited to get there, gets pulled over by a state police officer. He, of course, walks up to the window. She rolls her window down. License and registration. She says, I don't have a license and registration. To which he says, oh, hello. Don't worry about your license and registration. And then he saw something hanging from her keychain. Oh, you're a Sigma Pi Alpha Beta Gamma. I'm a Delta Phi. As if that like is a compatible like sorority, fraternity, and he's on to something here. So, he says to her, it's your lucky day. I'm just curious, where were you off to so fast? And she says, I'm visiting my fiance in prison. And he says, step out of the vehicle. Really? Because then he wrote the biggest ticket, my father will attest. So big that the next prison visit that Sarah came to see me, and she was an inmate, basically. But beauty only took her so far. See, the Proverbs speak a mother talking to a son, right? Proverbs 31:30. Charm is deceitful. Beauty is one thing, but it's passing and fading. A woman who fears the Lord, she is to be praised. Right? So God's using Esther's external beauty to bring favor, but there's something more to Esther, her character, her godliness, her virtue. How do I know that? Watch this, verse 17. Then the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained, here it is again, grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. It reads like a Cinderella story, doesn't it? 3 times in the matter of a few verses, favor given by God, favor with men, favor by God. The king is so moved by Esther that he crowns her queen. A coronation ensues. Verse 18, and the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther. He names it after her for all his officials and servants, and proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. It's a countrywide party celebrating the king has found a new queen. They perhaps even cut taxes in celebration. So there's some idea here that everybody's blessed because of Esther's coronation. Now we stop, we pause, and we literally ask the question, because as we see it, we go, man, how lucky is that? How lucky is she, guys? I'm so glad things worked out for you. Anybody ever said that to you? People say that to me all the time. Me, personally. Hey, Matt, man, things really worked out for you, didn't they? I'm so glad things worked out for you. And I know what they're saying. I know there's some sincerity there, but I receive it like this. Things didn't just work out for me. Things don't just work out. God works things out. Providence understands things don't just work out. It's not good fortune. It's God's favor that works things together. And we have to see it that way. Because a lot of life comes with a lot of pain and a lot of setbacks and a lot of hurt. And if I don't understand God's providence, I get bitter. But when I understand no matter what's coming my way, if he's allowed it, if he's authorized it, if he's authored it, there's going to be a good from his economy that comes out of it. Like Romans 8:28 entails, right? And we know all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. The word work together is a compound word. In the English language, it's synergy. And I love that because we know what synergy does. Synergy is taking several things and blending them, combining them. It's a synergistic effect. Your life, the good, the bad, the ugly. From the moment you had breath, from the womb, to the days that ensued, to the day you will be called home to stand before God. Every last thing that happens, God is working together. Does that remove the pain? No. Does that remove the hurts? No. It should remove the regrets. Because in my life, to regret something is to say that I know better than God. That I wish it didn't happen the way it did because I know better than you, God, who allowed it. When I was growing up, one of the things I enjoyed with my mother was, she always corrects me. I say, we were baking brownies. She goes, son, we were not baking brownies. It was boxed brownies. All we did was follow the instructions. I'm like, all right, whatever. In my little mind, I enjoyed it, and you would let me get all the items, and I would go in the fridge, and I would look at the back of the box, and it said, grab 2 eggs, and I'd grab the eggs, and grab the measuring cup, and fill it up with 3/4 cup of oil, 1/2 cup of water. Make sure you grab the batter, you pour it into the bowl, but one of the most important instructions, which you don't overlook, it says it at the top, it says, make sure you preheat the oven to a certain degree, 375 degrees, and now, here we go, I'm supposed to do what it tells me to do. Now pause, because a lot of us take life with the divided ingredients. I look at the things that happen that are good, the blessings, and that's like the water. Everybody enjoys drinking a cold cup of water. The water blessings of life, I can accept that. But then there's these cracked egg experiences. And we don't like that. Nobody's gonna drink a cup of eggs, or it's not gonna be enjoyable in and of itself. Same with the oil. The oil is the bitter of life. I'm not gonna take that cup and just drink the oil. Oh. But what happens is, I'm supposed to put it all into the bowl. And when I put the water in and the eggs in and the oil in, I then do synergy. I begin to work it all together. And it takes on a certain consistency. And when it's all blended, I take a lick, right? But then I poured it into a pan. The pan was previously anointed with butter. That just hit me. That was good. Right? And then, because if you don't put the butter in, it's gonna stick. And then what happens is, the entire time, look at me, the entire time the oven was preheated. God knew the very circumstances in your life, and he presets them before you get there. He knew exactly what would make it all come together. And if your life is the brownies, when you are subjected to the heat, it brings it together. When you come out on the other side, people can enjoy your life because of what you've been through. That's Romans 8:28. That's providence. Now, when virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. If you're looking at verse 19, there's a second gathering of virgins. Why? Because probably after Esther is queen, an additional year or 2, or maybe 3 have passed. And the king, remember, he's dissatisfied. So he calls more virgins. Esther likely would not have had access to his presence during these times. They also would replace the older women in the harem with new, fresh, younger, more beautiful women. Now, why is that a detail to consider? Time has passed. Mordecai is now within the king's gates. The king's gates was a place where you would be hired to either administer commerce or judicial matters. Mordecai, her cousin, is given a job, perhaps solicited by Esther. You seen how all this is taking shape? Now, Mordecai's in the gates. What's gonna happen next? Now, Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. Verse 21, in those days, there's a timestamp, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Verse 22, so the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Let's work our way from the back of the verse to the top. The Persians kept fine records of everything. That's why we have so much knowledge into their culture. They documented everything, even the way they executed their criminals. When it says gallows here, you automatically, like I did, thought of a noose and a hanging. That's not the gallows here. This is a stake, a wooden stake that would impale a criminal, and they would place him through his either torso or his neck, and they would impale him. That's the gallows here. The Persians created the crucifixion. The Romans perfected it. This is the origin of that type of execution. Mordecai, out of all the places in the kingdom, he's in the gates. He overhears a plot, a hidden plot, to assassinate the king. These 2 eunuchs have access to the king. History tells us Ahasuerus, Xerxes, would eventually be assassinated years later. So this isn't far-fetched, and yet God places Mordecai in the right place at the right time to overhear the plot. He tells Esther, his cousin, about the plot. She tells the king. The king documents it, but he doesn't reward Mordecai. Why is that important? Persian kings would reward loyalists generously. Why? To prevent things like this from happening. If everybody found out how richly the king rewarded the one who told him the secrets of the kingdom, then you were less likely to withhold information that would get you honor. But Mordecai does not get the honor. So I conjecture, and I say, I wonder what that felt like. He's overlooked. He just did the king a service. The next chapter is going to give us another timestamp. Several years pass. He knows that people are honored that do favors for the king, and yet he isn't. Something of Mordecai's character had him constantly and consistently still trusting God and serving. Something like this happened in the New Testament, Acts 23:16. Do you remember the account? Paul's taken into custody by the Sanhedrin, and the Jews want to kill him because every time Paul speaks, it's either a revival or a riot. And he's in custody, and Jews are gathering to plot, the hidden plot, to kill the apostle. And you know what the text says? Acts 23, verse 16. Read it on your own. It says, and Paul's sister's son overheard the plot and went and told Paul. Really? Like this little boy overhears them plotting, goes and tells Paul. Paul tells his custodians. The custodians take him to safety. He eventually goes from Jerusalem and makes his way to Rome before Caesar because God had a plan. Man is immortal until God's purpose for his life is final. You will not leave planet Earth until God allows you to accomplish his will. Nothing can touch you. Doesn't mean we live recklessly, but the point in this is we're going to see later on in the book of Esther how that book, the Chronicles, kept. Mordecai's saving grace to the king is going to be rewarded at the right time. So it's not just rewarded here. Like, think about this, and I'm almost done. He's rewarded here at this time. He gets what? Maybe some riches, some gold, maybe a couple homes. I don't know. Like, that's great. Wait until you see at the right time when he's rewarded. It's so providential. It points to the cross. Final point, man's plots fall perfectly into God's plans. Do you understand that? And when you look at your own life and you recognize whatever has happened against you or to you, man's plots fall perfectly into God's plans. So there'd be no better way to end a message like this than to talk about the cross. Because the cross was man's plots. It was the evil intentions of man, the religious leaders, and the political establishment, all of which wanted to get Jesus crucified. And all the while, this was part of God's plan. This was not the devil trying to keep him from the cross. Many have made that suggestion. No, that's why the devil put it in the heart of Judas to betray, because that would set in spiral the very momentum that Jesus needed to be on the cross, because God was going to use that. Why is that significant? That is the greatest evil ever happening on planet Earth, that we put God on a cross, and that was divinely appointed by God himself. Do you believe this? If you believe this, would you receive this? Let's pray. Father, so we do declare your providence, your goodness, your faithfulness. We thank you that we have access to see behind the scenes, even in accounts such as Esther, and how you are weaving and working your way and your will through the natural, supernaturally. So would that be real to us in our lives? No matter what we're up against, what we're going through, we would recognize that you are a gracious, good God, accomplishing your will, not violating human will, and all the while doing so for your glory, your honor, and your praise. So I ask for favor upon your people, like you gave Esther and Mordecai. Favor in these days to represent you. Bless us and keep us. In the name of Jesus, we magnify you, O God. Would Christ be magnified? Amen.